Good morrow, one and all. I'm Mr. King, and today we'll be analysing the poem A Poison Tree by William Blake. This is a very simple poem, so we'll dive straight into it. First, I'll read it through with you and check we understand what's going on. Then I'm going to pick out some language and structural features you might want to talk about in your exam. And then at the very end, I'm going to add a little section about how Blake uses metre, which you might find a good way to make your answers stand out. At the very end, I will include my 5 key quotes that I would memorise in preparation for the exam, and at the very end, I'm going to give you a piece of exam technique, which is really important for this poem, so do check that out. Before I begin, if you'd like any more videos like this, then please hit those like and subscribe buttons. Without further ado, let's dive straight into the poem. Here we go. I was angry with my friend. I told my wrath did end. I was angry with my foe. I told it not. My wrath did grow. And I watered it in fears, night and morning with my tears, and I sunned it with smiles and with soft deceitful wiles. And it grew both day and night, till it bore an apple bright, and my foe beheld it shine, and he knew that it was mine. And into my garden stole, when the night had veiled the pole. In the morning glad I see my foe outstretched beneath the tree. Okay, so very simply, Blake's narrator is angry with his friend, deals with his anger, problem solved. Blake's narrator is also angry with his enemy. He doesn't deal with his anger. The anger grows. He compares his growing anger to a tree growing. And eventually his anger gets so big that it leads to Blake's narrator killing his enemy. And at the end of the poem, we see Blake's foe lying dead beneath the poison tree. Quite a straightforward poem, which is pushing a very straightforward message. And the message is this: warning, repressed anger can be really dangerous. Here, Blake's narrator represses his anger, and it's devastating in its impact, whereas when he didn't repress his anger with his friend in lines 1 and 2, problem solved. I'll just put on the screen for you some quick notes to help you work your way through the poem. The only bits of language which might be tricky are lines 7 and 8. Remember that in this poem, Blake compares his anger to a growing tree. So when he says he sunned it with smiles, what he's saying is he helped his anger grow in the same way you might help a tree grow by giving it sunlight, by putting on fake smiles and by putting on soft, deceitful wiles. Wiles just means tricks. So he put on sort of deceitful tricks to trick himself, to trick others that he was all okay, but actually he's seething with anger on the inside. Also, line 14 sometimes is a bit tricky. When the night had veiled the pole is a reference to the pole star, which is a really bright star in the sky. So in this final stanza, when Blake's narrator kills his enemy, this takes place on a dark and gloomy night when there are so many clouds in the sky that you can't even see the pole star. I hope that helps. Okay, let's dive straight into our language and structural analysis of this poem. Although, quick reminder, remember that when you write about this poem, or any other poem for that matter, please don't identify language techniques or structural techniques without explaining why they're important, why they are there, what the effect of them is. You will get no marks for going, look, there's a metaphor. You need to explain what is the effect of that metaphor. Blake uses an extended metaphor because. Alright, let's dive straight into this. So, language and structural features. The first thing that I would pick out is that Blake uses very simple, very matter-of-fact vocabulary. Why? Blake uses very simple, matter-of-fact vocabulary to reinforce his very simple moral message in this poem that repressing your anger is incredibly negative. Look at stanza 1. I was angry with my friend, I told my wrath, I acknowledged my anger, I dealt with my feelings, and my wrath did end. Full stop. Very declarative, very matter of fact, dealing with your anger had a positive outcome. Whereas lines 3 and 4, I was angry with my foe, I told it not, my wrath did grow. I didn't deal with my anger, I didn't speak about it, I didn't acknowledge it, my anger got worse. So the simple, matter-of-fact vocabulary reinforces Blake's message that repressing your anger leads to negative consequences. We also see this with Blake's use of contrast. Look at how he contrasts lines 2 and 3. Lines 2 and 3, I beg your pardon, lines 2 and 4. Line 2, my wrath did end, versus line 4, my wrath did grow. So we can just see two possible outcomes, one is positive, one is negative. Blake uses contrast to reinforce his message that repressing your anger leads to negative outcomes. If you wanted to make a slightly more sophisticated observation about this poem, you could talk about how Blake uses rhyme in the poem. Throughout we've got rhyming couplets. Friend rhymes with end, foe rhymes with grow, fears, tears, etc. Why does Blake use a regular rhyme scheme? After all, rhyme creates quite a cheerful tone, doesn't it? And it's a bit bizarre to have such a cheerful tone in a poem about anger and death. I would argue that here Blake is using his structure to mirror the content of the poem. The structure of the poem is to have a regular rhyme scheme, which creates a cheerful tone. In the same way, Blake's narrator fakes a cheerful attitude when actually something much darker is going on inside. I mean, in the second stanza, for example, we can see that the narrator is faking cheerfulness, he's putting on smiles, he's lying to everyone about how life is great with his soft, deceitful wiles, whereas inside he's harbouring a deep and violent anger. In the same way, Blake uses an ironically cheerful rhyme scheme to hide the much violent anger that is contained within the content of this poem. Another thing you could look at, in fact, let's be honest, the key thing you should be analysing if you talk about this poem is the extended metaphor. Throughout this poem, Blake compares his anger to the growing of a tree. We first see this in line 4. He talks about his wrath growing like a tree. He then talks about making his anger bigger in the same way that you might water a tree to make it bigger in line 5. He talks about how he allows his anger to grow in the same way that you might give a growing tree sunlight in line 7. We can see that the anger is getting bigger and growing every day, just like a tree in line 9. And eventually the anger becomes so big, it actually starts to produce something of consequence. In the metaphor, the tree produces fruit, and in the same way, Blake's anger, or Blake's narrator's anger, causes violence at the end of this poem. So the tree is a metaphor for the growing anger, which is made worse by the repression of it. Another technique you could look at is Blake's use of anaphora. Anaphora is when you begin multiple lines of poetry with the same words or phrases. So in this poem, the anaphora is caused by the repetition of the word and. And I watered it in fears, and I sunned it with smiles, and with soft deceitful wiles, and it grew both day and night, and my foe beheld it shine, etc., etc. The anaphora symbolises Blake's growing excitement, or perhaps it symbolises that he is getting carried away as he represses his anger more and more. So you could argue that Blake uses anaphora to show that his repressed anger is getting more and more out of control, getting more and more overexcited, and this makes the tragic outcome at the end of the poem seem more and more inevitable. Another thing you could pick out, which I have listed as structure, but alliteration counts as language and structure. It's one of those weird ones which counts as both. We have some sibilance. So sibilance is the repetition of the S sound, which we have in line 7. And I sunned it with smiles, says Blake. So sun, smiles. Why does Blake use sibilants? Blake uses sibilants here because it creates a sinister tone, which suggests that this repressed anger is sinister, is evil, is malevolent, and can come to no good. Now, another thing you could talk about in this poem is Blake's use of light and dark imagery. If you want the technical term for it, it's chiaroscuro, using light and dark imagery in close proximity to one another. But again, please remember, please don't go, look, Blake uses chiaroscuro in this poem, and say nothing else. That would be really unhelpful. It won't get you any marks. You need to say, Blake uses chiaroscuro because. I will say why I think he uses it, but let me unpick it a bit first. So, we have light and dark imagery caused by the references to day and night. And then, once his anger is so strong, he says it's almost like a tree has produced fruit. Now, I don't know if you've ever tried to plant a fruit tree. I have actually, and I can tell you that it takes a long time before a seed of a tree will turn into a tree that can produce fruit. It takes a long, long time. So the extended metaphor of a tree also suggests that the anger has been repressed for a very long time, if it is indeed producing fruit. But I'm getting off topic. Back to the light and dark imagery. When the tree has produced fruit, in line 10, Blake says that it bore an apple bright and that the apple was shining. Now, this is bizarre imagery to use in many ways, because normally we associate light with positive connotations. We associate light with heaven, joy, peace. But here, the light or the brightness or the shining is used to describe this apple, this forbidden fruit, this produce of repressed anger. So here I think that Blake uses the light and dark imagery ironically. While the fruit of his anger might seem good to Blake's narrator, it's certainly not good to anyone else, and indeed we see that when the foe is dead, outstretched beneath the tree. Furthermore, if you look at line 14, we can see that the murder of the narrator's enemy takes place at night, when night had veiled the pole star, so no one could really see anything. And here we have the dark imagery used in a kind of more stereotypical way, in the way that Gothic horror stories have used it for generations. Here the murder takes place on a dark and gloomy night, and that's almost a form of prophetic fallacy to reinforce the message that oppressed anger leads to violent, negative, even evil outcomes. There's some nice alliteration in this poem, or some brutal alliteration I could say. In line 10, bore an apple bright, quite aggressive alliteration used here. Why is there quite brutal alliteration used? It's used because it reinforces that this repressed anger leads to violent outcomes, which indeed it does in this poem. And finally, I would like to talk about an allusion, not an illusion, but an allusion that takes place in this poem. An allusion is a reference to another story or another event, and this poem has enough going on in it that it would remind Blake's readers of a very famous story, the story of the Garden of Eden. If you're not familiar with the story of the Garden of Eden, it's a biblical story describing the first two humans created, Adam and Eve. They live in a beautiful garden, but they choose to disobey God by taking forbidden fruit from a tree. And as a result of sinning against God, that brings death into the world. Does that remind you of anything in this poem? Well, let's have a look, because in this poem, the narrator's foe also goes into a garden, just like Adam and Eve were in a garden. The foe tries to deal with the narrator's anger, which is symbolized by an apple on a tree, just like the forbidden fruit in the Garden of Eden, and by trying to deal with the narrator's anger, try to deal with this apple, it leads to the foe's death. So there's enough similarities there to remind Blake's audience of the story of the Garden of Eden. Why does Blake make this allusion to the Garden of Eden story? And having read a number of essays about a poison tree, please don't be the student who simply writes, Blake makes an allusion to the Garden of Eden story, without explaining why. You must explain why. Well, I think the answer to that question lies in Blake's attitude to the God of the Old Testament. Blake was a rather unusual Christian. He was a Christian, but he believed it was the God of the New Testament who was worthy of being worshipped, and he thought the God of the Old Testament was a vengeful, possibly even an evil God. So here, in the Garden of Eden story, Blake thinks that God is evil for allowing death to come into the world. In this poem, Blake's narrator is acting just like that God. He allows someone to come to death in a garden. And in the same way that Blake thought that the God of the Old Testament was vengeful and evil, here Blake's allusion implies that if you repress your anger, you are just as vengeful and evil as Blake thought the God of the Old Testament was. So, I hope you found that useful. I want to spend a few minutes very quickly thinking about how Blake uses metre in A Poison Tree. This is not essential to write about in this poem, but I know some of you do want to make your answer stand out by making some really sophisticated comments, so you can have a go writing about this. But again, as with everything, don't just identify the metre Blake uses, try to explain why Blake uses them. So here we go. The main form of metre that Blake uses in this poem is trochaic tetrameter. What does that mean? Well, trochaic tetrameter is when you have 4 pairs of stressed and unstressed syllables in a line. So for example, it should sound like dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum-de. Or, to put it into context, the witches in Macbeth speak in trochaic tetrameter. Double, double, toil and trouble. So the first syllable is stressed, the second is unstressed, and that repeats. So you have 4 pairs of stressed and unstressed syllables. Blake uses a version of that in this poem, but if you're looking at the poem and thinking, well, hang on, I should be 8 syllables in a line and I can't find many examples of that, you would be correct. Blake actually uses an incomplete version of trochaic tetrameter, and if you want the technical term, incomplete trochaic tetrameter could be called catalectic trochaic tetrameter. This basically means that he misses off a syllable at the end of each line. Dum-de-dum-de-dum-de-dum, blank, there's a missing syllable there. So, for example, I was angry with my friend beat. There's a missing beat at the end. There should be one more beat. So why does Blake use catalectic trochaic tetrameter? I would argue Blake uses catalectic trochaic tetrameter to create a really uncomfortable tone. It implies that the anger is unfinished. It implies that the poem is unfinished. And in this way, Blake's use of catalectic trochaic tetrameter implies that repressing your anger is an unfinished process and will inevitably lead to a negative or uncomfortable outcome. So if you have a look, you can see that throughout most of the poem there is a missing syllable in the poem, and this is catalectic trochaic tetrameter. But catalectic trochaic tetrameter is not the only type of metre used in the poem. Blake also uses iambic tetrameter. So tetrameter, that's the same word as last time. It's still 4 pairs of something, but this time it's 4 pairs of iambs, which go unstressed, stressed. De-dum, 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 de-dum. So here's an example from a Christopher Marlowe poem, and we will sit upon the rocks. It's the second syllable, which is stressed. And we have 3 examples of iambic tetrameter in this poem. Why does Blake switch from catalectic trochaic tetrameter to iambic pentameter? Goodness me, that's hard to say. Why does he do it? Well, iambic tetrameter creates a much more confident tone, Why does Blake use iambic tetrameter to create a confident tone? I think he does it in the first stanza to reinforce his moral message of this poem, that repressed anger leads to negative outcomes. I told my wrath did end. He's very confident, he's very assertive, but if you deal with your anger positively, anger leads to no more negative consequences, whereas he's equally confident in the fourth line that if you don't speak to your anger, if you don't acknowledge your anger, if you don't do anything with it, it will lead to something negative. And in line 16, the final line of the poem, iambic tetrameter is used again, my foe outstretched beneath the tree. This is very matter-of-fact. The iambic tetrameter creates a very matter-of-fact tone. It implies that the narrator feels no regrets, no shame for the murder committed at the end of this poem. So the use of iambic tetrameter here implies that repressed anger can not only lead to negative outcomes, but can also turn you into quite a callous, unfeeling person who doesn't really care about the awful acts that you may commit if you allow repressed anger to take over your life. So I hope you found that useful. If you have, please do hit those like and subscribe buttons, and if you have any questions about the poem, please do comment below. As promised, here are 5 key quotes that I would memorise in preparation for the exams. I do think it's important that you memorise key quotes going into the exam. You've got to write about one poem completely from memory for the B question, and if you haven't got quotes in your memory bank, then you're just going to find that a very inaccessible question. Now, I would like to end with a moment of exam advice, which I think is really important for this question, for this poem. By all means, prepare to answer questions on this poem. I mean, for one thing, it might come up in the A question, where you have to write about it and compare it to an unseen poem, so definitely prepare to write about this poem. However, when you do the B question, you'll get a question which should allow you to write about a number of different poems. Hopefully, you've revised well enough so that you will be able to write about a number of different poems. Try not to put yourself in a position where the only poem you could write about is a poison tree, because truth be told, a poison tree is a very simple poem, and it's going to be very difficult for you to write something that someone else hasn't also written. I can guarantee that 90% of the answers about a poison tree will talk about the extended metaphor at some point, and I don't know, maybe 75% will write about the allusion to the Garden of Eden story. If you want to get the top marks, you need to stand out, and a poison tree is not a poem which will allow you to do that. So in summary, prepare for it. If it comes up in the A question, give it your best shot, but make sure your revision in your other poems is effective enough so you're not forced to write about a poison tree in the B question, unless you really have to, because if at all possible, you don't want to be writing about a poison tree in the B question of your exam. I hope you found that useful. I've been Mr. King, and until next time, cheerio.